from the Willamette River Valley in what is now Oregon, the traditional homeland of the Kalapuya peoples. And as you know, Pendle Hill is located on and gratefully acknowledges that it is on the land of the Lenape-Hoking, the traditional homeland of the Lenni Lenape people. Welcome to Solidarity, Guidance for Engagement. This is the fourth in a series of 6 webinars entitled Working Towards Right Relationship with Indigenous Peoples. Before I fully introduce tonight's speakers and address some of the logistical issues we'll need to be aware of for the call, I would like to invite Kenneth Deere to open our evening together so that we can center in a spirit of gratitude and expectant waiting together on Spirit to lead us. Kenneth is a member of the Bear Clan from the Mohawk community of Ganawak and Secretary of the Mohawk Nation at Ganawak. Kenneth.
John, thank you for the introduction, and I'm happy to be taking part in this event this evening. In my tradition, we among the Haudenosaunee, the Mohawk, of course, are part of the what was known as the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy, made up of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cuba, Seneca, and Tuscarora nations, and we have a tradition that every time we have a gathering, there's a particular kind of speech that's made, and it's called the words that come before all others. And an elder would stand up and speak, and normally it would be in their own language. But I am not a fluent Mohawk speaker. I'm a victim of Canada's genocidal policies of trying to destroy our language and culture. And so I'll do what I can in the English language. And in this opening, Thanksgiving, we first of all acknowledge all of creation. And from that, by acknowledging creation, we start with the very earth beneath our feet and all the grasses and plants that grow from that, and particularly the medicines that the Creator has given us. And we thank the Creator for all of these things that are there for our well-being, and also to all the sustenance that it gives us. What in our case what we call the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, that give us sustenance in our agricultural life. And we also give thanks to all the trees that always have a role in creation, providing us with material and providing us with warmth. And in particular, we thank the maple tree, which we call the grandfather of all trees, because it gives us the first, a crop in the spring when we have maple syrup, maple sap, which we cook and to make syrup to sweeten our foods. So we give thanks to the Creator for all the kinds of trees that we have at our disposal. And then we go on and we thank the Creator for all the animals, the small animals in particular at this time. You know, the squirrels, the raccoons, the fox, all these, the small animals, all of them that serve a purpose in creation. And also for the larger 4-legged animals like the bear, the deer, the moose, caribou, whatever animals that are large and that also have a role in creation. And one of them is to give us sustenance, clothing with their skins and tools with their bones. And all of them have a role in creation. And that we are grateful to the Creator for these things. And then we go on to our feathers friends, the birds that sing in the morning and that make our life so enjoyable. And the duck and the geese and the quail, all of these feathered friends that we have that also have a role to play in creation, and that we are thankful to the Creator for. And also we give thanks to all the fish in the water, from the smallest little crawdads to the larger salmon and all the fish in between, the whitefish and the catfish, all of those things that swim in the water. And we give thankful to the Creator for these things, because they also serve a purpose in creation. And they also, one of the things that they do is provide us with sustenance, so that we may carry out our role in creation. And then we look to the skies and we thank the Creator for the four winds, the winds that take the clouds away and bring us to the sun for heat, and also brings the rain that replenishes our streams and ponds and rivers. And also it brings lightning, the lightning that purifies the air, and that all of these things play an important role in creation, and for the cycle of life that it helps maintain. So we give thanks to the four winds. And also at night, we give thanks to the stars in the sky that guide our way. And each of those points of light, we say that's where we go after our death, that we go up into the sky world. And then also we give thanks to the grandmother moon, and its role in creation, where the relationship it has with the women, and it's it symbolizes the women in our societies. And we give thanks to the Creator for the moon, that also controls the tides and other issues in our life, some of the things we may not even understand. And of course, we also give thanks to the sun, for which without the sun there would be no life, and that we regard the sun as a representative of the Creator. That's such high importance that the sun had for us, that we look at the sun in this way. So we give thanks to the sun. We thanks to the Creator for the sun, the light and the warmth that it gives. So once we've given thanks to all of creation, then we look at ourselves, and today, as we sit here and we meet, in our deliberations, we should keep into consideration all of creation, of what the Creator gave to us to sustain ourselves, and that any decision that we make when we meet should not jeopardize creation, should not jeopardize all the gifts that the Creator gives to us. That's important for to sustain ourselves, because like the animals and the plants who are part of creation and have a role in creation, we as human beings, we are also animals, and we have a role to play in creation. And then and the Creator has given us a mind, so that we can have a better understanding of creations, supposedly. And then it is our role in life to find out it is our destiny in life to find out what is our role in creation. Where do we fit in creation? Like the animals and the birds and the waters and the trees, we have to find ourselves in our life where we fit in creation, so that everyone can be sustained and so that as the way the Creator intended. So with these words, I open this meeting, and that we keep in mind creation as we carry on in our duties and our life and the purpose of this meeting. So thank you, John, and I'll give the meeting back to you.
Thank you, Kenneth, dear, so much. I would like to begin by thanking our co-sponsors once again, who helped us organize this and promote it, and that would be the Canadian Friends Service Committee, Decolonizing Quakers, and Towards Right Relationship with Native Peoples program of Friends Peace Teams, as well as members of the Planning Committee and the Pendle Hill staff for supporting us. First among them being Francisco Burgos, who is the new executive director of Pendle Hill, who just took over that role as of September 1. But tonight he is also with us as the technical person, as he has been for each of the preceding webinars. With that, I'd like to go into a couple of technical pieces. You are all participants are muted, and you will not be able to unmute yourself during the course of the webinar. If you are encountering technical difficulties, please use the chat feature to inform Francisco of your problem, and he'll do his best to assist you. We expect that our speakers this evening will generate questions among the participants, and as questions arise, you are invited to write them in chat, and that will send them to Francisco. All chat messages go only to our host, Francisco. You will not be able to chat with other participants. And Francisco will be sending me as they occur, and I will do my best to field and moderate those questions as they arise in chat. As always, we are recording this webinar, and it will be made available to registrants at some time in the future, probably early in next week, after it has been reviewed and edited as necessary. Registrants will be notified via email when the recording becomes available. So please don't keep sending requests saying, when is this going to be made available? Because as soon as it is, you will get notice of it. It is now my honor and pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. I'm going to start with Kenneth Deere. As I said, he is a member of the Bear Clan from the Mohawk community of Ganawake and secretary of the Mohawk Nation there. He's the former editor of the Eastern Door, an award-winning and independent newspaper that has served his community. He has been probably maybe known to other Quakers here as he spoke at Friends General Conference several years back, as someone who is very active. He was the chairman and rapporteur of the UN Workshop on Indigenous Media in New York in December of 2000. He has won numerous awards. He's been involved with the development and promulgation and promotion of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He has been a participant in the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. So he's someone who's very actively engaged both at the local level with his very own community, as well as on a global level with the community of Indigenous peoples internationally. I refer people to our biographical sketches, which in some cases are much more extensive than sketches, on our website, Working Towards Right Relationship with Indigenous Peoples, on the Pendle Hill website, for a more full exploration of these biographies. I'd also like to introduce Chief Dennis Coker, who is a lifelong resident of Kent County, Delaware, and has been honored to be the elected principal chief of the Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware since 1996. He also has been very active in both in his the tribal nation, but as a representative of that tribal nation on various Delaware State Historic Preservation Office, the Federal Census Bureau, has worked extensively with the Chesapeake Bay watershed in consultation with the federal government, and has been an active person in outreach in the Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania areas on behalf of the Lenni Lenape. So both our speakers this evening have been serving their own communities and yet reaching out to non-native communities and collaborating with them as well in enterprises that are of benefit to the larger community of nations of the indigenous peoples. So we are very honored to have them with us this evening. And I would like to start by asking Chief Coker to begin this evening's remarks. Thank you so much for both of you being here.
Thank you, John. And I thank you, Kenneth, for your very moving Thanksgiving address, the words before other words. We use that particular format of prayer for opening our meetings as well. And I thank you once again. I thought it would be appropriate for me to just talk just a little bit about my community so that you'll get a little clearer understanding of who we are and what we represent. So I was born in a community of about 1,000 people who were all blood-related individuals that still exist here in their traditional homeland of Kent County, Delaware. As a matter of fact, on the 2010 census, we actually had 700 people self-identify as Lenape citizens. Was quite amazing for me. I never thought that we would generate that much interest, but you know, it's ironic because there were 700 people that self-identified as Lenape, but we have only been able to enroll a little over 200 of them. So that in itself, I believe, speaks volumes of the feeling towards or the feelings of Indigenous peoples who have been very disconnected from their culture for a long, long time. I know that when I was young, I never fathomed that I would be functioning in the capacity that I am in today. It just didn't cross my mind, even though we had constant conversations around my household about being Indigenous. And, you know, so it just was something that wasn't talked about a whole lot. As a matter of fact, you know, as a community, we were known as the Moors of Kent County. And they spell that M-O-O-R-S. C.S. Westlager wrote a book about the Moors of Kent County back in 1943, and he called it Delaware's Forgotten Folk. So when the AIM movement, the American Indian movement, came into the spotlight around the 1970s, the late 70s, there was a rekindling of the Indigenous spirit in our communities. We actually are flanked on our east by a sister community from southern New Jersey, the Nanticoke-Lenni Lenape, and we're flanked on to the south by a Nanticoke community. So in essence, there are three communities of Indigenous peoples that exist in the mid-Atlantic between the states of New Jersey and Delaware. Those three communities actually provided the service of you know, allowing us to diversify our gene pool because we intermarried with those people pretty exclusively for the last couple of hundred years. So much so that for all intent and purposes, we are all basically the same people, even though we still maintain three separate tribal governments. So around 1991, my elders got together and they decided that they really wanted to formally rekindle the Indigenous spirit in our community. So we formed a 501c3, and we looked at that name Moors that we had been labeled with as early as, I don't know, 1860. And we decided that, and even in collaboration with a couple of anthropologists, we could not find any connection with that particular name and our community. So it was determined that we settled for that name just simply because it was less offensive than many of the names that we had been called throughout that period. But we decided to, take a hard look at our area and its original people. And, since we can document our existence in this area in the history books back to 1750, it was just a no-brainer that we were a remnant population of the original people that inhabited this land. So we went with the Lenape moniker, the Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware, and we approached the state within a couple of years for official state recognition. And, as it happens in many cases, we weren't successful on that try. Actually, we were opposed by one of the neighboring tribal groups who was a little bit more influential than we were, a little bit more politically connected. And it took us almost 25 years of working with the state, working with other partners and collaborators, working with the federal government. We got to the point where we had been challenged on an Indian arts and crafts violation, and I went to our state government, and they came to our rescue by providing us with a state recognition that was codified, and that happened in 2016. So, it took me almost 25 years to convince our own state government, who had a very clear record of our existence, to recognize us. And it was a long, long struggle. And during that period, we had very little interest from outside groups, and even those that approached us were really never certain that we were credible for some reason or another. But immediately upon state recognition, the floodgates were opened, and we began to get requests from everyone. It seemed like every environmentalist wanted a Native American standing next to them on their stage, advocating for whatever issue that they were endorsing. Many of the faith-based organizations that had issued documents disavowing the doctrine of discovery, they were contacting us. And that's actually how I came into such a good relationship with our friends, the Quakers, because they were one of the early faith-based groups to disavow that doctrine of discovery. And I kind of got really involved in that discussion, going around giving presentations and meeting a lot of people. And, we were positioning ourselves to really be a voice for the indigenous people of this region. It became very clear to us early on that we needed to develop some sort of protocol for working with indigenous peoples, just simply because many of the people that were approaching us really had no clue as to what to expect and what to really talk about, and what questions to ask. So the protocols are not very extensive. They're based on the simple concept of respect. And most of the indigenous communities that I'm aware of that exist in in my area are underserved minority communities for the most part. And a little respect really goes a very long, long way. So at the top of our list of protocols is to be very respectful and understand that, you know, these groups, the ones that I represent, are lacking resources that it's just simply incredible that they've been able to stay afloat as long as they have. They just are very resource poor. So, and moving on down my short list here, it seems that before you actually decide to reach out to an Indigenous community, you kind of really need to do your homework. You need to probably look at their website. You need to read a little bit about the history of the particular group wherever you're located, and familiarize yourself with a little bit about their history. Learn what titles they use and how they're important, and use them when you can, and ask them really, you know, how do they want to be referred to? I'm not very particular myself, but as a matter of fact, I had to be convinced to call myself a chief 25 years ago when I just couldn't conceive of the idea that I could be a chief. You know, it's just something I never had thought about, but I got used to it. And so, but learn those titles. As a matter of fact, you need to learn all you can about these groups because they, you know, they have a certain feeling about themselves, and you need to understand their worldview from their perspective to a great extent. And you can imagine how many calls we get from people who really haven't done their homework. And, you know, I find myself sitting on the phone just with a simple phone call, sometimes an hour giving a history lesson to somebody who calls with a simple lesson because they do have so many questions, because they haven't looked and looked at the history. And next on my list, talk to the tribal leaders and try to get a sense of how they view the etiquette that should be required to deal with their tribal community. All our Indigenous communities are different to a great degree. They're all sovereign nations. They come from different areas of North America, and you know, they do things a little bit differently in wherever you go. So talk to those elders and those tribal leaders and get a sense of what example that should be followed with outreach to them. The next thing is, it's very important that you demonstrate that you're an honoring person. And I know that even with our own tribal citizens, some are mixed with non-indigenous blood, but I insist that they know their ancestors on all sides of their family. It's just very important to me as a tribal leader that you know who you are, you know who your ancestors are, and you know this is a sign of a good citizen in a tribal setting. And it helps also if you understand your own family's role in colonization. You know, how did your ancestors contribute to the conditions that exist today in Indian country? And again, it's also important that you get an understanding of how you may participate in decolonization, which is one of our true focuses of leading in our tribal communities, is how can we decolonize? How can we get rid of these Western concepts that have been so destructive to our communities. And, for us being a first contact people, that began 400 years ago. And as a matter of fact, the reason that I point to as us still living in our homeland was the fact that we Christianized very early. So, we have been Christian Indians for a long, long time. As a matter of fact, the old saying goes, a praying Indian is a safe Indian. But there are still some, colonized attributes and attitudes that outside of that faith base that, we suffer from as a people, and the society at large must work with us to decolonize as much as we possibly can. We have our diets that need to be decolonized, and just our thinking processes. That idea of being, and we were a matriarchal society, and now we're living in a patriarchal world. That requires some attention on its own. So we think it's helpful that you work as individuals and groups with your local parks and libraries and clubs to advocate for having Native Life Wage programs in conjunction with Native organizations, Native governments, to help them tell their stories and help them display their art and help them talk about their culture. Like I said a couple of minutes ago, after the pandemics of the 17th century, in our case, it was mostly smallpox. Our population was diminished to the point of about 90% of our people died during that 100 years between 1600 and 1700. And with those deaths, the vulnerable parts of our population, being the elders and the young, we lost all of our wisdom keepers. We lost all of our teachers. We lost many of our next generations. So when you have a disease like smallpox, which rears its ugly head about every 15 years, every 15 years we would lose 50% of our villages, and those people would have been the storytellers and the wisdom keepers. So much of our culture was actually lost. And when I was in the Moravian community in Ontario, Canada, a few years back, there was a young man who came to the podium in their tribal center the day that I was getting ready to leave. And he talked about this legend that he had heard in his life. He was from the Moravian community. And the legend went like this. He told us that those that left, they did so to remove the customs and the traditions and the culture from the European influences, from the colonizers. And they became known as the keepers of the culture and the tradition. He went on to tell us that those that stayed behind, they stayed behind in order to maintain a connection with the land. And they became known as the keepers of the land. And in this legend, at some point in time, the keepers of the culture and the tradition were reunited with the keepers of the land. And me being in his community at that time brought this young man almost to tears with what seemed to him to be the fulfillment of this legend. And with Indigenous people, their spirituality actually emanates from their relationship with the land. So it's very important to understand that spirituality because it comes from their place. And we're so fortunate here to be still in our homeland, where my cousins in Ontario, Canada, are actually refugees to this day. They arrived there in I don't know, 1789 or 1790, and have lived there ever since. So if you can identify a group, a friends of group, many of our communities have the Friends of the Nanticoke, the Friends of the Lenape, the Friends of the Nanticoke Lenape. They're a good group to connect with because they really try to help us in ways that utilize their own particular resources, whether it be writing or fundraising or, just working on projects. And you're able to really to share with that group many, many tools that could help our tribal governments. And I think it's lastly, we need to acknowledge the fact that we don't know all the answers. We just don't. In many cases, we are learning as we go. If it wasn't for the Moravian missionaries that were living amongst the Lenape, the Heckwelders and the Zeisbergers, who did a very thorough job of documenting our language, in many cases documenting our culture. They spent 20 years with those people back in the 1750s, and they were already, the main body was already west of the Susquehanna in Pittsburgh. Many of them were already in eastern Ohio, but they left a very clear documentation of what it was to be indigenous and Lenape and Iroquois specifically. So the information is there, and it takes a lot of time to sit down and read those documents and try to get a clear understanding. There are some of us who operate from genetic memory, blood memory. And I know I seem to have an ability to put myself back in time and try to imagine, what it was that my ancestors may have been thinking or doing in a normal time. And we had no recorded history. And starting at contact, things became to be very abnormal very quickly, and proceeded in that manner until present, actually. So just keeping in mind that that we don't really have all the answers, but we're willing to work with you, work with others. We work with anthropologists and our archaeologists, and try to figure out our past as best we can. And it's turned out pretty well for us, but we still have a long ways to go. We still receive a lot of offers to collaborate, and I, for one, since I've been retired for a few years now, engage as often as possible in all of those activities. So it's just been an amazing journey for me, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have for me as we move through our program. Wanishi.
Wanishi. Thank you so much, Chief Coker. So we can share those protocols with you. I think Chief Coker will send them, and I will include them as bullet points, although I love the elaboration that Chief Coker gave to them. Kenneth, may we hear from you?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Chief Coker for his thorough explanation and history of his people, and also he had a whole lot of information to give to our guests. And I don't know why you needed me. I think Chief Coker did such a terrific job. I just, all I should say is just listen to that guy, and that would be that would be enough. First of all, I have a whole lot of respect for Chief Coker, and I understand, the struggles of the Lenape people, and of course we were neighbors with the Haudenosaunee and the Lenape. We rubbed shoulders. Hopefully, we weren't at friction too often. I'm sure we were, but I think that at the height of the Confederacy, I think that we had good relations with Lenape, and we think we shared stuff. And your southern neighbors, the Tuscarora, were also related to us, and they came up from the Carolinas to join the Haudenosaunee in the early 1700s. So there was a lot of movement and the pressures that came in from the Europeans who landed on the East Coast was immense, and caused a lot of damage, with disease, and also I think there was religious spirituality, attacking, undermining our own spirituality, doctrine of discovery. If you weren't a Christian, then the European discoverers could claim the land on behalf of their king or their sovereign. And that kind of damage still exists today. Still today, those kinds of the concept of the doctrine of discovery, based on the papal bulls, which, like I said, any discoverer like Columbus or the Spanish would come. And if the indigenous people that they came across weren't Christian, then the discoverers can claim the land for their sovereign. And that's what dispossessed our indigenous people. And that was the beginning of the disempowerment and dispossession of indigenous people all the way up until today. Even the American courts, Canadian courts, other courts depend on use the doctrine of discovery even today to justify the dispossession of indigenous people. And I was encouraged by Chief Coker's also a description of the struggle of the Lenape of his people, and I think those are the struggles of many people who were perhaps denied their indigenous identity early on, and had to remake that identity in later on or closer to today. I think that the whole issue of identity is very, very important. I think indigenous peoples have a right to decide who their identity is. We can and we should be able to ascertain for ourselves that we are Lenape, or we are Mohawk, or Seneca, or whoever we are, based on our lineage, based on our historic connection to the land, which is very, very, very important. It's when in the opening, when we talk about creation, that's who we are. We feel that the Creator put us here, and the Creator put us here because it's our role. It was to take care of the Creator's garden, all of those, the plants and the animals that the Creator had put here. The Creator, whether it's a he or she, I don't want to get into that argument, and our role was to take care of that, not to dominate creation, like in Christian philosophy, to hold dominion over everything. That's not our role to dominate. Our role was to coexist with creation in an ongoing matter. And what I find annoying about the non-indigenous people, I mean the U.S. government, Canadian government, states, provinces, is this whole idea of recognition. First of all, when you identify for yourself, you self-identify, and if you're a Lenape, you're a Lenape. If you have this linkage to your land and your territory and your culture in some way, and it's passed on from generations to generation. That's all that you need. It's not up to governments, state or federal governments, to decide who is indigenous. The Creator decided who was indigenous. The Creator put us here. That's the entity that decided that that we were indigenous. You know, it's not. And the federal and state government should not interfere what the Creator had put here. You know, just like the plants and the animals, you know, the states and the federal and state government cannot decide which is an American blade of grass or an American tree or anything else. In the same way, the indigenous people, they can't decide who is indigenous and who's not indigenous. We decide that for ourselves. You know, and we believe the Creator decided that, and we believe strongly in that, and that's why we have such a strong relationship to the Creator through creation. Yeah. And we honored it. That's our linkage. It's not to the King of France or England or Spain or anywhere else. That's where our linkage is to the Creator. One of the when the founding fathers created the 13 colonies, as you know, they were pretty feisty with one another, and they didn't know how to govern themselves because they only knew how to govern themselves by a king. And their Europeans, political structure was the king was sovereign, and we as indigenous people, we had to teach the settlers that it's the people who are sovereign, and that and the chiefs that we appoint are only there at the whim of the people, and the chiefs are not sovereign, but it's the people that are sovereign, and that's why the U.S. Constitution begins with "We the people," because the people are sovereign and not the state. Certainly not President Trump is not sovereign, although he likes to think that he is. But we, as indigenous people, we believe it's the people that are sovereign, and we have to act that way. We have to believe that we're sovereign, and if we believe we're sovereign, then we act like we're sovereign. And that's why, like Chief Coker says, you do what you can, you do everything that you can to be Lenape, because if you believe you're Lenape, then you'll act like Lenape, and that's how you assert yourself. You don't ask governments for your rights. What you do is you assert your rights, because the rights of the indigenous people are inherent. We were born with these rights. They weren't given to us by states or federal or state governments, and we were born with these rights, and we have to, of course, we recognize that, right? We self-identify as who we are and the rights that we were born with. And then the resistance is, that we get is from states and governments because of land. All the confrontations and all the problems that we have is always about land, the natural resources, because we are the original owners of the land. It's our land. It's not theirs. Christopher Columbus did not make North America Spain, Spanish land, or the other explorers that came after him didn't make this French or British land, because it was our land, and it always should be, and always be recognized as that. At one point, I wanted, which always disappoints me when I hear about people struggling to assert their identity, is that when other indigenous people try to deny other indigenous people their identity, and it's disappointing to hear, in particular, if the Lenape of Delaware are not being recognized by other indigenous people in the region. I think this is, I'm trying to find a nice word. I don't want to call it racist because they're all the same race, but it's certainly disingenuous for one indigenous people to deny the existence of another indigenous people. I find that incredibly selfish of those that act that way, because in general, it's not about identity or about brotherhood, certainly, or denial of brotherhood. It's always about finances and economy, and the threat that another indigenous people have to their benefits or whatever they have, whatever recognition is that they have. And so I'm always disappointed when I hear that there's resistance from other Indigenous people to fight for the federal recognition or state recognition of other peoples. You know, it's disheartening, and I think it's very un-indigenous for anybody to do that. You know, and you can quote me on that if you want. You know, that's not being indigenous to deny other people their indigenous identity. I think that I think it's good to be indigenous. By the way, I think it's one of the most wonderful things to be is indigenous. I'm a Mohawk. I'm very proud of being Mohawk. And when you're saying that, once you are recognized as being Lenape, how many people would show up on your doorstep? You know, environmentalists and others would want you on their side, and that feels good, actually. You know, because it's opposite from what it was before.
Yeah. When
people were denying their indigeneity, and didn't you know, folks would want to hide the fact that their parents or great grandparents were indigenous, you know, because of racial discrimination, the racial superiority that people felt that indigenous peoples were a lesser people than others, and so they would hide it. I like to use what's happening in Latin America, where usually you go to Mexico, you go to any of these countries in Latin America, they're very obvious that they're indigenous by their features and stuff like that. But you know, but if they have one Spanish ancestor, they consider themselves Spanish and not indigenous. And it's only been in the last 20 or 30 years where there's been a resurgence of indigenous people in Latin America saying, "Hey, no, I'm indigenous. I'm not Spanish, but I'm indigenous," and that's an awakening of their pride in who they are, you know, and that same thing happens in many ways in North America, where people are discovering that, gee, my grandmother was telling me that I'm part Indian, but it says don't tell anybody. So you know, there's that resurgence and that you know, pride in being indigenous. And non-indigenous people who want to help and identify, and also I think many non-indigenous people are proud to know indigenous people. Or I think they have a sense of, some people have a sense of I guess that they have a brother, or that you know, a brother people that are indigenous, that have been here from time immemorial, and that they are glad that we have survived the Holocaust, that have survived our Holocaust that's been carried out against us, and that they're amazed that we're still around, and because of that, they want to support us to make sure that we continue. It reminds me of a story.
Just a second.
Sure.
Speaking of that, wanting to stand in solidarity, I'm hoping that you're going to speak to some degree about how that can best happen, along with the guidance that Chief Coker has given us, Kenneth.
I think he gave the best one.
Okay.
He gave a better explanation than I would do. And the reason why he can do that, because he's actively immersed himself in that, and his points that he elaborated, I cannot improve on those. You know, he did a really, really good explanation of how you can help indigenous people. One of the issues. Wait, I want to finish my story because it just jumped in my head. I travel to Geneva every year to attend UN meetings regarding indigenous people, and I was checking into my flight to come home in Geneva. And speaking of identity, we don't use a Canadian or American passport. We use a Haudenosaunee passport when we travel. It makes it a little bit hard to travel. But it's a way of identifying. It's a peaceful way of identifying ourselves. And then, so this clerk at the counter, who was Asian, I'm pretty sure she was Sri Lankan, and so I presented myself with my passport and stuff like that, and she says, "You're a Native American?" I says, "Yes." I said, "I thought you were all dead."
Yeah.
And I says, can I touch you? So she touches my hand. I said, yeah, sure, go ahead, touch my hand. And she was so impressed because she thought we were all dead, you know. And I made her day, I guess. But the point of the matter is that we surviving a Holocaust is something that makes Indigenous people special in that way, that we managed to survive this long. And I think that one of the things that, of course, was part of what I call the Indigenous Peoples Holocaust is a racial discrimination that we face, and that racial discrimination is embedded in American policy and in American legislation and in the court system, and that it's forever there. And it's those kind of that kind of discrimination is very, very difficult to fight. And that's one of the areas where we really need the help of indigenous of non-indigenous people to combat that invisible racism. I call it invisible racism because you don't see it. People don't realize how racist the policies are. You know, for instance, there's one that affects our people on this side. The one from I live on the Canadian side of Mohawk Territory, and for me, there is our people won a court case in 1927 that we could travel back and forth across the U.S.-Canadian border because of previous treaties and judgments before us, the Jay Treaty in particular, and others, the Treaty of Niagara, some very, very old treaties. And the federal court decided in 1927, an appeals court, confirmed by an appeals court, that Indigenous people from Canada have a right to pass freely back and forth to the United States. So the United States was afraid of a flood of Indigenous people from Canada coming and living in the United States and working in the United States. So they made a law. They made an actual law that says that any Indigenous people that comes from Canada to the United States must prove that they are 50% a blood quantum to be considered an Indigenous person, and that is exceptionally racist, and it's probably the most racist piece of literature still on the books. It still exists today, that the immigration officers can challenge me or anybody else to prove that you're at least 50% blood quantum to be, so that you can come into the United States. And that's the kind of racism that's there. They're taking the ability of Mohawks to decide who is a Mohawk, and made a formulation based on great grandparents or great grandparents, and that's not just, and that's not right, and that's racism. Blood quantum is a racist formulation, and I know that it's common in the United States. I mean, also in other areas where there's 50% threshold is important. But it's not, blood quantum has nothing to do with language or culture or heritage so much as who you believe you are and what makes you who you are. But those are that's one example of the kind of racism that Indigenous people face, and that's invisible to the rest of the public. And our court system, even Justice Ginsburg, who just passed away, was unfair in a judgment against Indigenous people, when basically she said we waited too long to go to court, and that it would be too much of an inconvenience to Americans if she decided in favor of the Indigenous proponent in the case. So even a very progressive American can judge negatively towards Indigenous people, deny Indigenous people justice, and so that's the kind of discrimination that people have to be vigilant about and rectify, in a way that they can, and look for it. And if you can't find it, ask an Indigenous person about what is racism, towards them, and they can tell you. I think Chief Coker can tell you lots of things that you can find that is against the Marshall's decisions. The 3 decisions by Justice Marshall, 1800s, that are used today, are applied to today, that discriminate against Indigenous people, and not only in the United States, but in Canadian courts. When it comes to land decisions, government lawyers refer to the Marshall decisions in the United States, which Marshall decisions, justify or rationalize the papal bulls and the doctrine of discovery, that we don't own the land that's underneath our feet. So I want to, I really want our allies to remember and to try to put yourselves in our shoes when it comes to try to empathize with Indigenous peoples about the systemic racism that we face today in modern society. It's not just in cowboy movies. It's really alive today. Is there another question? John, I think
we have gotten some questions that have come in. If you're ready to field some of those, I'm happy to
sure
start on the line of questioning.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps this one would be for Chief Coker. Could you say more about the implications of being a matriarchal society living inside of a larger patriarchy or patriarchal society? What implications does that have for the questions before us this evening?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, just simply because the patriarchal system is such an amazing system, and it was completely discounted by our colonizing visitors. And that's one of the reasons that they were able to get so much land, because they didn't ask the women, they asked the men. And the women actually owned the land. It wasn't the men that owned this land. And that's evidenced by the fact that our women always stayed here. They never left. They didn't go out on walkabout like our men did. And I have been encouraging the women in my community to rise up and reclaim that status that you once had. Because it's very important. I think the world would be a very different place. It was our women who told us when to go to war and when to stop fighting. They'd say, you guys need to come back home and quit acting like a bunch of boys out there. And, we need you back here. And they were listened to. So I think there's major benefits to having women leaders. We had an archaeological site here in Delaware that they excavated in the 1960s and 70s. It was called the Island Field Site. And it was a shell midden, actually. And they uncovered about 20 burials there. But there were 7 of those burials that stood out according to the grave goods that were associated with those burials. And all 7 of them were women. And, the grave goods indicated that they were leaders, very influential people. So, I think that we would have a much more compassionate society, filled with much more empathy for your neighbor, your brother, your sister, your relatives. And even when it comes to our environmental relatives, because, we as a culture don't have resources per se. We have our relatives, the trees, the plants, the animals. And that's why we were so thankful. Before or shortly after we harvested any one of our relatives, we'd make an offering of tobacco, thanking that relative for giving us their life for our sustenance, you know. So I think there would be just a tremendous shift in the way that we view the world if it was viewed through the feminine perspective. And, you know, and just saying that, I think, answers the question, you know, because we certainly know the difference between a man's view and a woman's view. But the problem is, as I see it, is that our women today have been subjected to this colonization. They've almost lost their desire, you know, to stand up and be heard to a great degree, especially to be leaders. You know, that one of the reasons that I've been able to be the elected chief for 25 years is, I often say, it's one of two reasons. Either I'm doing a pretty good job or no one else wants the job. And I think that it's probably a combination of the two, because, you know, I struggled to get my women to really stand up. Now, you know, I say that tongue in cheek because my tribal council is all women. I'm the only man that sits on our tribal council, and in my 25 years, our council has been predominantly women. But it's very difficult to even get those tribal leaders to go out and give talks and to talk about their culture, to, you know, to educate themselves so that they're able to have these conversations. And, you know, it's a struggle. They're tasked with a lot of daily activities. You know, me, I've been a single guy all my life, and I don't have a TV in my house, so I've been able to do a lot of reading. I'm an adamant reader, but it's still very difficult. But I think that if we could make that transition, we'd be in a much better place.
Thank you. A provocative question that I think we'll leave on the table was, how would that look practically for the matriarchs in Lenape, your tribe, to take power away from the privileged patriarchs? But I guess you would have explained that by saying that actually, in terms of tribal leadership within your community, the women are playing a very large role. So if that's okay.
And that's demonstrated really by our grandmothers, who have been very, very dominant forces in our lives. And it's almost subliminally, but, you know, our grandmothers really provided us the direction, especially in an endogamous society where you had to be very careful about where your romantic interests were demonstrated. You know, my grandmother would certainly tell me that, you know, that one's a little bit too close. You've got to, you know, go over there, and that one over there, she'll be just fine. You know, so I think our grandmothers were closer to the matriarchal society than our women are today.
Thank you.
John, can I jump in? Can I jump in on this point?
Yes, but I want to be mindful that we have about 20 minutes, and I think we really want to focus on some of the questions that were central to our evening together.
Well, I just want to reiterate about matriarchal societies. Matriarchal societies are traditional societies, and it was our governance systems that existed, you know, before European contact, and continue. In our case, continues all the way to today, where we have a clan system, and that the heads of the clans are the women, the clan mothers, you know, and it's the women that carry the clan, and a woman of a certain clan, like a turtle clan, for instance, her children are turtles. No matter who the father is, the father must be from a different clan, and it's the women that in our society that choose the chiefs. They nominate the chiefs, and and they also, the women can remove a chief if the chief doesn't follow the will of the people. That is different from the elected systems, those that are imposed by the American and Canadian governments that put in elected systems, and the elected systems are dominated by men, because that's the system that comes in from you, and that's the difference between matriarchal societies and the patriarchal society, because the elected systems that put together patriarchal societies. That's all I'll say for now.
Might have come from Christianization as well, I would think. I would like to, one person said, I think in the situation where Indigenous and non-Indigenous people may be working in a small group together to achieve a common goal, what habits of non-native Western thinking and acting can interrupt or prevent effective solidarity when Indigenous people and non-native people are working together in a joint advocacy or community action? I think that's one of the questions that is, and I have another one that I for sure want to ask as well.
Well, John,
either of you can start.
John, from my perspective, I must be very fortunate, because I really have not encountered anyone that I have worked with that has been offensive in any way or disrespectful. For the most part, you know, people that come to me are coming from a very sincere place. They actually want to hear what we have to say. And it's amazing how people are thirsting for Indigenous wisdom. And it seems that they come prepared to listen for it. And, you know, I think that at the very top of my list of protocols was being respectful. And if we can achieve demonstrating that respect in all areas of the conversation and any activity that generates from that, I think we've come a long way in, you know, in mitigating that possibility.
Thank you. Kenneth, do you have?
Yeah, it's you know, there's different kinds of working relationships. If you know, working relationships with people, organizations that support Indigenous people. Of course, the Indigenous people should be taking the lead and taking, you know, listening to perhaps the advice of Indigenous people. But Indigenous people, you know, have to be the decision makers in issues that affect them. In the ordinary workplace, though, if you work in a garage or an office somewhere, and you have you know, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people working together, and you can't have conflict over, and that is difficult when you have, when I talked earlier about racism and racial attitudes and issues of racial superiority, where the non-Indigenous people feel that they're racially superior to Indigenous people, is a problem, and it's a problem that many people, Indigenous people, run across in society. And I always felt that Indigenous people should always take the high road, you know, always, because Indigenous people have the high moral ground in the application of our rights of being equal to everybody else, and not lower themselves to being racist against non-Indigenous people. I think that we have to show ourselves to be better. Actually, we have to show ourselves to be better than non-Indigenous people, to be equal, rather than just to be equal, just to be the same as them, to be equal. It's an extra burden that Indigenous people carry, and it's difficult. It's very hard to hold your temper. It's very hard to hold your, you know, your anger back. But you do have to stand up for yourselves, and also educate other people by your behavior and by who you are. And if I'm answering the tone of the question in the right way. Thank you.
Thank you. This is sort of a kind of a a number of questions are interconnected, but let me phrase it this way. We understand that building relationship with Indigenous peoples is important for respectful engagement with issues affecting Indigenous peoples, but there aren't any recognized tribal nations in my area. Say, for example, Pennsylvania has no recognized tribes within its borders. And Pennsylvanians might very well say, well, there are no Indigenous people in my area. How do I begin to start building such relationships? And related to that question, I think, are questions for Canadians that are related to which Indigenous groups are you actually going to pay attention to or coordinate with, where traditionalists might be in one particular area, and there is tension between that group and a federally recognized I'm sorry, I'm not, these are all in small places for me to get the whole question. Yeah, where am I? So the one area is where there are no tribal communities, whether they're state or federally recognized or not, but even self-claiming indigenous populations in a community of organized community, and others where there are several tribes in the area. Where would you begin to a consultation with those Indigenous peoples?
Well, John, in my view, this is Dennis, and I understand the predicament the state of Pennsylvania finds itself in. I travel to Pennsylvania quite often to give presentations and to talk with people that are interested in building a relationship. And you're absolutely right that distance, historically is supposed to make the heart grow fonder, but sometimes it's an impediment to active collaboration. And because to build a relationship, you've really got to make an effort to get to know the target of that relationship, the two targets. And when we only get together once every 3 months or every 6 months, when people don't fully really understand the situation that you find yourself in, sometimes it's difficult to have a meaningful relationship. And I strive to accommodate most requests that I get, just simply for that reason. Now, when it comes to, when you have multiple groups that you live amongst, I think the most local group is probably the immediate target. And if you can't find fulfillment in that particular community, I would suggest that you just keep searching. It's very important to us as Indigenous people to have non-Indigenous support. We don't have the population that allows us to be a major political force. And it's just that simple. Here in Delaware, the Indigenous population is 0.5%. So without non-Indigenous support, it's very difficult for us to get any political action at all. It simply just doesn't exist. Politicians really don't want to talk to you. I was really lucky in 2016 with our recognition legislation because we had unanimous support in the Senate and the House of the Delaware legislature. I mean, we got absolutely no votes. So you would think that, we have general support in our population, but I'm not so sure that actually is the case. Depending on the issue and depending on the complexities of your state governments and, I'm an environmental guy, but getting environmental legislation passed in the state of Delaware is very difficult to do. It just simply because, we are sympathetic to businesses and, and without garnering some non-indigenous support to even move a worthwhile piece of legislation forward is almost impossible for us to do as a, just as an indigenous effort. So, you may have to search a couple of different tribal communities. Sometimes personalities get in the way. If you aren't demonstrating that number one protocol of respect and someone gets offended real easily, that's certainly going to be an impediment to developing relationship.
If I can jump in at this point, I can't speak very much to the situation in Pennsylvania because I'm not familiar with it. However, I will say that there is not a single square foot of North America that is not the traditional homeland of an indigenous people. Yeah. So I don't know, who's claiming to be indigenous or is indigenous in Pennsylvania. I don't know. I know the Senecas is part of our country. We're into the along Lake Ontario. We're probably part of Pennsylvania at one time. But somewhere along the line, there were indigenous people. The traditional land of Pennsylvania is on indigenous. It is indigenous land to somebody. Regarding the issue of traditional indigenous people who follow their traditional political societies, structures, and those that are imposed by the American or Canadian government, it's a conflict that that states enjoy, governments enjoy. Dividing and conquering indigenous people has been the stock and trade of Europeans since contact, and that we have to be very careful how we deal with those kind of issues. I'm a traditionalist myself, and I feel very strongly that our rights are inherent, that we got our rights from time immemorial, and our political structures are from time immemorial, and that those kinds of structures have a stronger argument for our inherent rights than entities that are created by the Canadian or American government, band councils or tribal councils, etc. And but it's not a way to disparage the indigenous people in there, but it's a disparagement of the colonial governments that created them, and that's the enemy. The enemy is the government that created them. It's not the indigenous people themselves who take part in those other structures. However, those other structures must understand the viability and the moral arguments that those that follow tradition have, and there has to be a way of respecting I guess the moral high ground that traditional societies hold in North America.
I think that one of the questions that's following up on that is Chief Coker's suggestion about allying with tribal governments, and several folks from what is now Canada, I think, are asking, well, which governments ought we to be connected with, elected band councils or traditionalists? And then a similar question responding to Kenneth's comments about indigenous groups that deny the identity of other groups. How would the speakers respond to the idea that consultation with non-federally recognized, self-identified tribal groups erodes the sovereignty of the recognized tribes? a sort of thorny issue that has been with us since our very first webinar. If either of you would care to weigh in on those questions.
I'd be happy to weigh in because we've had that problem in our area here in where there are, there are limits to self-identification. It's not absolute in the sense that anybody can say, well, I'm deciding that I'm going to be make up some kind of a word, I'm an indigenous person. An actual fact was a group went to Washington once to say that they were indigenous people of the earth because they believed that they were seeded. They are descendants of an alien race that brought them here to Earth, and so they were claiming to be indigenous. And I am not joking. This is an actual fact. I was present when they tried to claim this in the Organization of American States that they're claiming to be indigenous, and we had to confront them and say, that's not what indigenous means, and that's not the kind of indigenous people we're talking about. But here locally, we've also had some people of very, very questionable indigenous background who are claiming to be indigenous, giving out ID cards, and also what the main fact is that they just wanted to get any kind of benefit that indigenous people had when they didn't really have a link to the homeland. They didn't have any kind of grandfather, great grandfather, great grandparents. There's no link to the past and no link to the land. They were just decided that they were indigenous, and that is a problem. And it's one thing to be self-identified, but the other thing too is that you have to be recognized by other indigenous people that you're indigenous. And it has to be done in a fair and objective way for that to happen. So yes, there is a problem with self-identifying indigenous people, but there has to be very understandable linkages to the land from time immemorial, and that's an important part of identifying who is indigenous and who is not.
Well, if I could interrupt just for a clarifying question, I'm thinking that part of the question that's being raised here is not between in Canada, as I'm understanding it, that there are traditionalists that have their own continuous relationship with the land. There is no doubt that they're indigenous, but there are also other indigenous people who are part of elected councils and so forth that aren't necessarily in mesh. There's no doubt about the indigeneity of either of the groups, but they are in some sense competitive. And again, obviously, as a result of the colonization that has created these problems in the first place. But I think the question is then how do you, whose has the legitimacy to be consulted with as you are approaching, or both, or?
Don, can I make a comment real quick?
Go ahead.
I think that question lies solely in the interest of the person seeking the relationship. There is a large divide between many of the traditionalists and the administrators of these tribal governments. So if in fact you're looking for a relationship that at some point can give you some sense of the actual culture of the people, then you need to look towards the traditionalists who have maintained that culture in a very strict manner and sense for time immemorial. The structures that were created under the the acts of 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act, are simply put in place to represent democratic governments that mirror the format of the United States government so that there can be a relationship between governmental entities. And it's amazing how disconnected, in many cases, those political structures are from the actual traditionalists that you know are the heart and soul of all indigenous communities. And to your other point, I really have experienced that that opposition from federal tribes in consulting with a tribe that's not federal. I've sat in on several consultations that I have been invited to by the federal government, by the Interior Department, the EPA, the Energy Department, and if there are federal tribes on the call, federally acknowledged tribes, and they learn that I'm a state recognized tribe, many of them will refuse to even remain on the call. And in many cases, they have managed to have a separate consultation arrangement with the entity seeking the consultation, because it seems like the government agencies really desire to consult with the state recognized tribes as well, but you know, the federal tribes who really have the power in that struggle, because the laws that require these consultations specifically indicate that federal tribes are the target of the consultation effort. So it is very difficult at times, and it has been contentious at times. But I think that position is softening over time. I'm certainly not going away. And, you know, so I think we can find some common ground if we continue to strive, you know, for that amicable relationship.
Last word,
if I can answer,
Kenneth.
Yeah, I'm not going to speak against other indigenous people. All right, in the sense that you know, you're asking a question: who should we should you know, allies, people who want to support indigenous people, should they support the traditional people, or should they support those that follow the elected system? Is a hard question. I think it's a choice that they have to make, because I'm biased. I'm biased. I'm a traditional person, and like I said earlier, I believe that our inherent rights are historical, and our treaties, the treaties that we have with Great Britain and France and the United States, are made with traditional people. The treaties weren't made with entities created by the U.S. or Canadian government, because they came later. They came after the treaties were signed. So, right. So and a treaty is an international instrument. A treaty is a document between two nations. You know, it's a nation-to-nation relationship. Those treaties, and we, as traditional people, we believe that we're those nations that made those agreements. And we believe that we sovereign people, and we have a nation-to-nation relationship with either the United States or Canada, or Great Britain, France, or any other country for that matter. Our first treaties was with the Dutch, and we still believe that we have a nation-to-nation relationship with the Netherlands. So we look at the elected system as a service delivery system. Is how the United States and Canada can deliver things like education or health or water and sewer, and that's how we look at that. And they have a use and they have a purpose, you know. But one thing that electeds don't have, they don't represent the treaties, or that treaty relationship, the nation-to-nation relationship that we have with those states, because those particular pieces of legislation that created them were there specifically to undermine the nation-to-nation relationship that we have with states. We are the Mohawk Nation. We're not the Mohawk tribe, and we're not a band of Mohawks, you know. But the U.S. tries to you know, undermine the nation-to-nation relationship by calling indigenous peoples tribes instead of nations. And in Canada calls us even a smaller entity, but bands, that there's I don't know how many there are, 665 bands in Canada, that's trying to destroy and undermine the nationhood. All Mohawks form one nation, and we're not the band of Ganawage Mohawks, but the community of Ganawage is part of the broader Mohawk nation that has a nation-to-nation relationship with Canada and the United States. And that's where that two-row wampum, which we never got to talk about, which is fine, that's that relationship that we have, that nation-to-nation relationship lies in tradition. And we have to find a way to make the traditional entities that have that inherent right to work in some way, in some cooperative way, or replace sometime or another the systems that were created by Canadian and American legislation.
Well, once again, thank you so very much, both of our speakers this evening. I know that I speak for all of our participants in thanking you for your time and your insights, sharing your experiences, and taking time to educate us and be forthcoming. And I think your words will be well remembered. I'm also reminded of just how complicated some of these issues are because of the history of colonization and the genocidal enterprise that European descended people settler colonists have visited, and making those issues more complicated. But I wish to thank you very, very much for being with us, and thank all of you participants for being with us this evening. I'll let Francisco end the call. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're very welcome. Thanks for listening.